Chapter 19. John had two equally strong desires, and he couldn't act on either of them. Because even if he knew where Hubert Vaughn was, he couldn't exactly hunt the guy down and kill him. And Denise didn't seem in the frame of mind for him to take her in his arms and hold her. In fact, she looked as delicate as a soap bubble. So he paced and tried to think. Why would Vaughn be killing off his victims? Was he afraid one of the women would come forward? If one did, would the others do the same? That had happened more than once in the previous few years. Famous men had been brought down by the women they'd abused. Was that motivating this? Why hadn't the other victims already outed Vaughn? John understood Denise's reasoning. She'd been depressed. Her daughter had been there, which would have added to her confusion and shame. Not that she'd done anything wrong. The thought of little Ella in her stroller had his hands fisting. What kind of man? No kind of man. A monster, not a real man. Real men protected women and children. They didn't take advantage of them. In her state, Denise hadn't been strong enough to deal with it. But why hadn't the others reported it, assuming they'd also been assaulted? Had he threatened them? Or was it something simpler, something baser? Denise could have gotten an acting job after that event. She hadn't. She'd stayed, tried to be the wife and mother her family needed, tried to get over it. But had the other women made the same decision? Or had they used the event to propel their careers? He started to head for the office to figure out the answer to that question, but caught sight of Denise, still staring out the window. Her mug was empty, so he refilled it with coffee and doctored it like he'd seen her do. He approached slowly, trying not to startle her. "I thought you might like something warm." She turned to him, quickly wiping moisture off her cheeks. He slid the mug onto the table in front of her, then snatched a napkin and handed it to her before he sat. "Thanks." "Sure." She wiped her tears and sipped the coffee, her gaze flicking to his when she tasted it. "It's good." "Are you all right?" "Just thinking about what happens next." "Meaning?" "I'm going to have to tell Agent Frank, right? Once I do that, it'll only be a matter of time before the information is released. Everyone will know." He hated to think about it, but she was probably right. Regular Janes and Joes got their privacy, but the same courtesy didn't extend to famous people. You have nothing to be ashamed of. Though she didn't argue, the slight, unamused laugh told him she disagreed. "The point is, I need to confess to Reed soon, immediately, because once the police know, there's no telling how fast it'll come out. They'll hear, Ella will hear." Denise's voice cracked. "I'm sorry, sweetheart." He hadn't meant to add that last bit, shouldn't have added it, but she smiled that natural Denise smile he'd come to appreciate. "In your research," he said, "did you happen to notice if the Slayer's victims did what you did? If they rejected Vaughn's offer?" "Oh." She tilted her head to the side, her dark hair fanning over her shoulder. He resisted the urge to brush it back. "I didn't." "Would that be hard information to find?" "Not at all. Easy, in fact. Let's just—" She stood and went to her laptop. He was glad to see her moving, getting involved. It helped to have a task. He followed to look over her shoulder while she navigated to a website called IMDb, typed in the first victim's name, then found her first acting job. Denise opened another browser and clicked around. Here it is. Lauren Leahy's first acting job was a supporting role in Perks of the Pep Squad, which took place in— Denise tapped the screen. "Alabama, where she's from. And there he is. Vaughn was the casting director." She clicked through the other 9 names. Though they weren't able to confirm them all, it seemed likely that most of the women's first jobs had been cast by Vaughn. Denise turned to him, waving toward the screen. "What more evidence do you need? Obviously, he's trying to keep them quiet." "Someone is," John said. "Do you remember the names of the other people who were with him at your casting thing? Why would one of them? Why would Vaughn? I'm not saying it's not him. I'm just not convinced. Guy like that, been getting away with it for years. He's probably arrogant. No probably about it. He thinks he got away with it. I mean, if I were Vaughn, you're nothing like him. Okay, but if I were him, I'd have targeted you first. You're the one most likely to come forward with the truth because you didn't take him up on his offer. You have nothing to be ashamed of. Do you think they do? The fire in Denise's eyes had John scrambling for an explanation. No, of course not. But wouldn't you feel a little like you'd... He swallowed hard. I mean, why didn't you? She opened her mouth and snapped her jaw shut. I had a family. And, yeah, okay. It's gross. Almost like payment after the fact. Exactly what he hadn't wanted to articulate. You have no idea how hard it is to break into the business, she said. The thing had already been done, so why not take advantage of it? Why not get a job out of it? Why not report it? A nobody wannabe from podunk nowhere accusing a well-known, well-respected casting director of assault? He'd have claimed consent. Denise gestured toward the laptop as if the man in question stood there. His word against hers. If he were even charged, he'd hire a great attorney and get off completely or with a slap on the wrist. Meanwhile, the victim would be blacklisted, her dreams of being an actor shattered, publicly embarrassed. Do you have any idea how often this kind of thing happens? A big-name sports star attacks a woman. She presses charges. He writes a check. She shuts up. Not because she's weak or greedy, but because she doesn't believe justice will be done. And will it? I mean... She paced away, then turned to face him. Especially in a situation like that. She pointed at the screen. Woman goes willingly into a room with a man, eager to please, to get a job. The judge and jury think she was trying to barter for what she wanted, sleep her way to the top. Isn't that what men think women do? Not. Or they think it's her fault. Even if they believe he forced her, they figure she should have known better. She walked into it. She had it coming. He gets acquitted, and she gets to live with the fact that she was stupid, and now everybody knows the greatest shame of her life. John walked toward Denise slowly. Okay, I see what you're saying. It's ugly. She looked at her feet, then up but beyond him, at anything but him. And you feel powerless. So yeah, if you can turn it around, make something good come out of it, then you feel like you've taken back some of the power. You're in control. And then you tell yourself you let it happen because it's easier than believing you're that vulnerable. Because if you were that vulnerable once, then you probably still are. And it could happen again. He understood that, at least to some degree. Lake and her friends had been incredibly vulnerable. Many injured, some assaulted, when he and his team had rescued them. How had Lake responded to that situation? She'd become a bodyguard. She was the toughest woman he knew. She wasn't about to let evil people hurt her or anybody she cared for. Her reaction might have been different from Denise's, but it stemmed from the same place. A wave of affection rose in John for his cousin, thinking of all she'd endured, and for this woman standing in front of him. He paused a foot from Denise, wanting more than anything to comfort her, but he wouldn't presume. Instead, he opened his arms. She stepped into them, and he held her against his chest. I'm sorry that happened to you. He felt her nod, but she didn't speak, just rested there for a long moment. He breathed her in, this beautiful, frightened, amazingly honest woman. Too soon, Denise glanced up at him shyly. Thank you for explaining that to me, he said. I understand, I think, to the degree that I can. You're not exactly vulnerable, though. Yeah, but, I mean, we all are, really. I can be taken down by someone stronger, or a bullet, or an arrow, or a car accident, or a fall. I'm no superhero. Every superhero has his kryptonite. Thank you, Ember Flare. Her smile was slight, but it was there. She stepped out of his arms and returned to the laptop. Vaughn is the most obvious suspect. He followed. Okay, but maybe there's something else at play here. We need to call Frank. She flinched. John stopped beside her, pulling his cell from his pocket. Denise? When she looked at him, her eyes were wide with fear. I can tell him if you want me to. She flicked her gaze to his phone as if it might bite. I don't think I can do it. You want to stay and listen? She seemed to debate that, then slid onto one of the bar stools. He might need to ask me something. I'll stay. This was one amazing woman. Not that he had any right to feel proud of her, but he did. He wrapped his hand around her upper arm and squeezed gently. She aimed that pretty smile his way, and his heart thumped a war beat in his chest. The woman she used to be, depressed, abused, insecure, afraid to fight back, afraid of the truth. That was not the woman who sat beside him now. She was changed, strong, new. He thought of something he'd read in the Bible recently, that God made a person new, or, not God, Jesus. Though if he wasn't mistaken, they were the same thing, or two different elements of the same being. He considered himself to be intelligent, but he didn't understand. In any event, maybe Denise's courage and strength, her newness, had something to do with God. And if that was the case, then maybe what she believed, what so many of the people he'd met in Coventry believed, was more than just a worldview with a bunch of rules. Now wasn't the time to delve into that, but it definitely gave him something to think about later. He dialed the CBI agent.
Chapter 20. You're sure you want to do this today? John had already voiced the question once, so Denise didn't bother to answer. It was mid-afternoon. The skies that morning had been beautiful, but thick clouds had moved in since then. She was seated in the front passenger seat of the SUV. She'd wondered if John would keep his distance today. He'd probably planned to, but after the hours they'd researched together that morning, after everything she'd told him, after eating lunch and planning this excursion, after that hug, he seemed to have forgotten the way they'd left things the night before. Behind them, the second SUV was filled with 4 bodyguards. Overkill if she'd ever seen it. But John had brought 4 bodyguards to Portsmouth as well, even though the other times she'd left the house, there'd only been John plus 3. Whatever the reason, if it meant they could ride alone, the 2 of them, she'd take it. John was stopped at the light on Main Street, watching her. She appreciated his concern. The conversation with Agent Frank hadn't been easy. The man seemed utterly devoid of sympathy, battering her with questions until John jumped in with, "You treat all your victims like this? Or are you just ticked we figured it out and you didn't?" At that, the CBI agent had apologized, even managed to feign kindness. The guy didn't like actors, but that wasn't Denise's problem. At least he was taking their theories seriously. "We'll bring Vaughn and his assistants in ASAP," Frank had said. "If the killer is any of them, we'll nail him." Would they really, though? Vaughn wasn't stupid. He'd get a lawyer. He wasn't about to confess to murder. If only she knew what would happen next. Her hands were clenched together in her lap, and she forced them to relax, closing her eyes. "Lord, you know exactly what's going on. Equip Agent Frank and the CBI to gather the evidence to arrest and hold Vaughn before anybody else gets hurt." "Denise." When she opened her eyes, John said, "We can still turn around." No. I need to do this today before the information is leaked." Frank promised it wouldn't be. "It will be. Things like this never stay secret for long. Maybe not today, but it's just a matter of time. And if that's the case, then there's no sense putting it off." She'd been putting it off for years. But one of the things she'd learned in rehab was the importance of doing the hard things instead of avoiding them. She was done avoiding. The light turned green, but John was studying her and didn't notice. "What?" she asked. "You don't seem all that worried." She nodded forward, and he hit the gas and turned. "I'd already planned to tell them," she said. "I figure the only way to clear the air between Reed and myself is to be honest about everything. I've known that for a long time. It wouldn't be easy, but the best things in life were often found on the far side of difficult and terrifying." Downtown Coventry was decked out for the holidays. Wreaths with bright red ribbons decorated the old-fashioned wrought-iron street lamps. Storefronts sported Christmas trees, garland, holiday vignettes. Greenery was draped on the benches that were interspersed on the sidewalk. Beside one, a couple of mechanical reindeer looked to be munching on the grass. She heard a tune and cracked her window. Sure enough, one of the businesses was piping holiday music through hidden speakers, though she wasn't sure "Baby It's Cold Outside" was appropriate for the Christmas season. The park and lake appeared at the far end of the road. The Christmas tree that had been the focus of Saturday's festival stood tall and proud against the gray sky. With its white lights glittering and its bright star on top, it shone in the low afternoon light. It was beautiful. But when John reached the end of the road and turned, Denise's stomach tightened. She'd been thinking about doing this, praying about doing this for years. But now that she was on her way, Lord help me. He would. He'd get her through it. It wouldn't hurt that she'd have John by her side too. She wouldn't be alone. He turned down the long driveway and drove through the thick forest that opened up to a big tree-studded yard. Reed had sold the little split level he and Denise had bought after college, and he and Jackie had built this place. Though Denise had offered to pay him alimony a few times over the years, he'd never accepted it, and he'd once told her that every penny she sent in child support went into a fund for Ella's future. Reed had never wanted anything from Denise. Honestly, she was pretty sure after she left that he would have preferred if she'd never come home. Though she didn't know how much money he made, she figured Jackie's income had paid for at least half of his new house. It was 2-story, stacked stone and brick, with a porch that looked like it wrapped all the way around. It was larger than most homes in town. She guessed 4,000 square feet or more. Gorgeous. Denise had always wanted to see inside, though she'd never been invited. Today, she'd invited herself. It only seemed fair to have this conversation in a place where Reed felt comfortable. John parked, and, once all the bodyguards were in place, Denise headed for the porch. Before she'd climbed the steps, the bodyguard standing there stepped aside, and the front door swung open. Jackie smiled and beckoned her forward. "Come on in." Denise stepped across the threshold, John on her heels, into a foyer that had to be 20 feet tall. On one side, a curved staircase led to the second floor. On the other side, French doors opened to an office. She could tell with a single glance it was Reed's office, and not just by the masculine decor. She recognized some of the books on the bookshelves, glimpsed multiple framed photographs of Ella and Reed's family. The mess scattered across his dark wood desk was the biggest giveaway. Seemed some things never changed. Jackie took Denise's hand and gave it a quick squeeze. "I'm glad you're here. I'm sorry to pull you away from your work." When Denise had called, Reed had told her Jackie was at work and too busy for your drama. But Denise had wanted Ella's stepmother to hear the story. She'd have to deal with it, just like the rest of them. It only seemed right that she hear it firsthand. So she'd texted Jackie, who'd promised to be available. Now, as Jackie led the way across the hardwood floors and into a great room, she turned back and said, "There are some things more important than work." Reed was in the kitchen, pulling glasses from a cabinet. He turned and lifted his lips in what was probably supposed to be a smile, then frowned at John. It looked for a moment like he might question the man's presence, but he didn't. "We have water, tea, soda." "I'll take ice water," Denise said. John positioned himself against the wall. "I'm good." He'd insisted on coming inside with her because he didn't trust Reed enough to let her be alone with him. Silly, but she hadn't argued. She wished John would sit beside her, but he was in full-on bodyguard mode. "Have a seat," Jackie said. She chose a pretty French provincial chair upholstered with a sage green and white toile. From her spot, she could see through the windows that covered the back wall and looked out over Lake Ayasha. Beyond the fenced-in yard, there was a little dock. Ella had told Denise about it, how she'd learned to dive right there, her father in the water, ready to catch her. Denise let her gaze roam the room. It had personality, color. The furniture wasn't all sleek and new, but comfortably worn. A Christmas tree in the corner was covered in multicolored lights, and red ribbon, and mountains of ornaments. Unlike Denise's place, everything about this home was cozy and livable. "Your house is beautiful." "Thank you. Do you know Tabby McCaffrey? Formerly." "Eaton," Denise asked. "She decorated it for us." "Oh, really? I need to call her." The person who did mine seemed more interested in creating a showroom than a home, all gray and white. "It's blah." Jackie tilted her head to the side. "It's got a lot of potential, though." That made Denise laugh. "You're very diplomatic." Her laugh died as Reed set a glass on the table beside Denise, then sat next to his wife on a cream-colored sectional, He rested his arm against the back, the picture of casual. What did you want to talk to us about? Apparently, the small talk portion of their visit was over. Silently, John shifted to stand behind them and met Denise's eyes, giving her a, "You've got this" look. Thank God for him. She wasn't sure she'd be able to get through this by herself. She took a deep breath and blew it out. I need to tell you 2 things. Things I should have told you a long time ago. Reed said, Go ahead. Jackie, kind soul that she was, leaned closer, almost as if to infuse Denise with courage. When Ella was kidnapped, Reed scowled, all pretense of hospitality gone. His arm came down, and he clasped his hands together. I was in rehab. You said you were in the hospital. The words were practically barked, which I never believed. No wonder. Rehab for what? Why didn't you? Reed. Jackie patted his leg. Let's let her talk. He clamped his lips shut. I'd been drinking a lot. Denise's voice wavered, but she kept going. And using some drugs. I got hooked. I almost killed myself one night. And maybe, on some level, she'd been trying to kill herself, but she didn't need to tell Reed that. The point is, I realized I needed to make a change, or I wouldn't survive. So, I checked myself into rehab. Why didn't you tell us? Reed's tone was angry, demanding. John glared at the back of his head. My contract with the studio has a morality clause. It's not that they care if their actors drink or use drugs, but they don't want that behavior to be public. I only told my agent, when I found out. You should have come home, Reed said. Do you have any idea? You need to stop talking. John's tone was low and angry. Reed turned to face him. I don't remember inviting you in. I go where she goes. Reed turned back to Denise, but under his breath, he said, I bet you do. The words were laced with innuendo. John stepped closer, a murderous look in his eyes. She wasn't sure what he was about to say or do, but she figured it wouldn't be good. It's okay, John. To Reed, she said, I'm trying to do the right thing here. It would really help if you'd behave yourself, maybe pretend to be a grown-up for 10 minutes. He started to speak, but Jackie rested her hand on his arm. To Denise, she said, We want to know the story. Go on. Denise focused on the redhead, trying to ignore the scowling man at her side. My agent had my phone when my mother called with the news. He came to the rehab center and told me what happened. I'd just gotten through detoxing. I decided to leave, was desperate to get back here. But my counselor said I wasn't strong enough to stay sober. And I fought her like crazy. I argued and cried. But she was right. I hadn't stayed sober an entire day for months. She told me that if I came home, I'd have to face all the judgmental looks and words I always dealt with here. Reed opened his mouth to interrupt. Not that I didn't deserve them, she hurried to say, but all that judgment didn't help. And that would be nothing compared to the fear of Ella being missing. My counselor laid out what would happen. I'd do my very best, but my best wouldn't cut it. Eventually, I'd fall off the wagon. Drink too much, pop a few pills, fall apart. And then you and our parents would have had to deal with me when all the focus needed to be on finding Ella. That would only cause strife and difficulty. Not only that, but the press would have made it all about me. The whole thing would all have become a media madhouse. It was Ella who needed everybody's focus, everybody's attention. Reed's gaze was hard. Since we both know you've never minded everything being about you, I'm guessing you were more worried your little addiction secret would have come out. You'd have lost your job. Tears pricked her eyes. Believe what you want, Reed. Nothing I say is going to change how you feel about me. You're right about that. Reed! Jackie's reprimand barely earned a glance from him. Again, Denise focused on Jackie. I didn't do anything those days she was missing. I didn't go to the group sessions or see the counselor after she convinced me to stay. I didn't exercise. I didn't eat. I just sat in my room and cried and prayed and begged God to bring her home. Her voice cracked with emotion, but she didn't give in to the sobs trying to work their way out. She wouldn't. She turned back to her ex. I know you don't understand. I'm sure you'll never understand, no matter what I tell you. But I love her. I've always loved her. Again, Reed's mouth opened, but before he spoke, Jackie said, "Be kind." Behind him, John warned, "Be very careful." Reed ignored them both. "You say you loved her. Some might argue that people who love stay. Remember, I told you I had two things to tell you. Let's hear it then." He nodded for her to continue. This was where it got hard. Very hard. She prayed for help, for words, for Reed to stop loathing her long enough to listen. And then peace brushed across her like a warm breeze, settled in her heart. She was still nervous, but she didn't need Reed's forgiveness or his acceptance. She was forgiven and accepted by the one who mattered. When Ella was 2 months old, I went to a casting call in Manchester. I took Ella with me. I wish I hadn't. She swallowed the emotion forming a lump in her throat. Reed's eyes narrowed the slightest bit. "I don't remember that." "I didn't tell you. I knew you'd be against it. You were so frustrated with me because I couldn't be happy." Reed's head dipped and rose, the slightest acknowledgement. "I didn't understand postpartum depression. What a big deal it can be. I've never dealt with depression, so maybe I wasn't as compassionate as I could have been. I just—" When he didn't finish the sentence, Denise said, "You didn't know." "I didn't understand either. We were so young." Beside him, Jackie slipped her arm under Reed's and gripped his hand. Denise wished she had a hand to hold. Her gaze flicked to John's. He didn't speak, but encouragement was clear in the way he looked at her, in the slight nod of his head. "I did well," Denise said. "At the casting call. I was there with Brittany. You remember her?" Reed nodded. "She watched Ella when I auditioned, but then she was dismissed and left. Everybody else was dismissed until I was the only one left. And then—" Her voice shook. Her lower lip trembled until she clamped her mouth shut. She needed to pull it together. I was taken back. I assumed they wanted me to read again. I assumed all three of the people who'd been there before would be there again. I had Ella in a stroller, but she was sleeping. I thought it would be all right. But there was this big Hollywood casting director, and it was just him and me, and he... She dropped her face into her palms and hid. "He what?" Reed sounded furious. She was afraid to look at him. "He what?" "I'm sorry, I never meant... Ella was there, and I was so scared. I'm sorry, I just..." She couldn't say the words. She didn't want to say them, not to this man who loathed her so much. She tried to force them out of her mouth, but they were lodged in her throat, holding in the sob that wanted to escape. Cool fingers slid against her upper arms and squeezed gently. "You don't owe anybody an apology." Jackie had crouched near, her kindness a whisper in Denise's hair. "He hurt you?" She nodded, and the sobs escaped. "That wasn't your fault," Jackie said. Denise peeked to find Jackie looking at her with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry that happened to you." A couple of tissues appeared in her line of vision, and she looked up to see John beside her chair. She took the tissues and wiped her cheeks. "Do you want to keep going?" Jackie asked. She nodded. "I need to explain it all." Jackie settled on the floor beside her and took her hand. The small act of solidarity brought a fresh round of tears. John's palm rested on her shoulder. Finally, she faced Reed again. He was still seated on the sofa. He looked stunned. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice was a whisper. "I was afraid that you'd—" She took another breath. "That you'd be angry with me for putting Ella in that position. You loved her so much. And that was good, of course. I loved her too. But after she was born, it was like I no longer mattered. I mean, I know that's not true. It was just, in the depression, it was how I felt. And things were so hard between us. So strained." Reed didn't react, didn't move, just stared at her with those eyes she'd once loved. "Maybe you would have reacted well," she said. "I don't know. It wasn't fair that I didn't give you the chance to prove me wrong. I know that. But I was afraid. If I told you what happened, and you got mad at me, or you blamed me, which would have been... I mean, I shouldn't have gone to the casting call in the first place. He squinted and angled back. She braced for an attack, but he said nothing. I shouldn't have taken Ella with me. Obviously, I should have just... But if you'd reacted with more worry for Ella's well-being than mine, I didn't think I could take that. So it seemed easier not to tell you. But I couldn't get over it. I tried. I really tried. But after a while, between the depression and then that, and our marriage was so hard, I started to think everybody would be better off without me. She sniffed, took a deep breath, wiped her eyes. I shouldn't have left, she said. I should have stayed and worked harder, tried harder. I should have seen a counselor. I should have told you the truth. I'm sorry I didn't. I'm sorry it's taken me 8 years. I hope you can forgive me. Reed stood. He didn't move, just looked down at her. There was a look in his eyes she'd never seen before. It wasn't anger or rage or even sadness. He looked stricken. And then he walked out, just like that. Jackie popped to her feet. Reed! Just 1 minute. His words trailed him as he marched away. A door slammed. Jackie stared after him. John crouched down beside Denise. Are you all right? She was. She might have wished for a different reaction from her ex, but she hadn't expected one. In fact, she'd sort of expected him to yell at her or call her a liar. Maybe she should be thankful he'd walked away. I'm all right. I guess we should just go. Give him time, Jackie said. Jackie gave Reed a lot more credit than he deserved, but Denise could wait. She'd done the hard part. It wouldn't hurt to linger a few minutes. John held out the water Reed had set beside her. Better have a few sips. I'm afraid you're going to get dehydrated. All that crying. His voice held a hint of amusement. He was trying to make her smile. She liked that. Thanks. She sipped, more thirsty than she'd realized. They stayed like that. Jackie kneeling on one side, John standing on the other, all three silent. For minutes that dragged forward like heavy boots through thick mud. Denise started to count. 60 more seconds, and then she was leaving. She was halfway there when the sound of a door opening had John and Jackie looking. Reed was coming back. Jackie stood and backed away. John didn't move. Denise steeled her courage and set the glass on the table. Whatever he had to say to her, she could take it. She felt prepared for his anger or even his cold dismissal, but he dropped to his knees in front of her. His eyes were filled with tears. He reached toward her, but didn't take her hands, just held his there. An invitation. She slid her palms against his. He looked toward the ceiling, clearly trying to get his emotions under control. That gesture had new tears filling her eyes. And then he looked at her. I am so sorry. You didn't. It's my turn to talk. He attempted a smile, but it didn't hold. All these years, I've hated you, when really, if I'd been half the husband I should have been, none of it would have happened. I mean, maybe the thing with the... He pressed his lips together, swallowed. The monster at the casting call. But if I'd been supportive, you could have told me. You could have trusted me to have your back. If I'd tried harder to understand what you were going through, maybe... He shook his head. Maybe we could have gotten through it together. Sobs rose from deep within her. Reed pulled her close. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. She laid her head on his shoulder, feeling known and understood for the first time in 8 years. Because he'd been her husband, her best friend. He'd promised to love her and honor her, and then he'd loathed her. And now they were past it. He leaned back to face her. Can you forgive me? I forgave you a long time ago, Reed. Can you forgive me? He nodded, but couldn't seem to speak as he pulled her in again. They stayed like that a long time, crying, remembering, forgiving. She didn't want Reed back, not as a husband, but now that he understood, now that he'd forgiven her, it felt like they'd come full circle. They'd started out as friends way back in kindergarten. Maybe they could be friends again. Even better. Maybe they could be family.
Chapter 21. John hadn't thought the idiot ex-husband had it in him, But Reed had surprised him, shocked him. Never had he seen a transformation like that, seen a man go from hate-filled and judgmental to gentle and humble. Denise and Reed had ended their hug after a few moments, both laughing awkwardly and wiping their eyes. Now they were discussing when Denise would be able to see Ella again. Wednesdays didn't work because there was some potluck at the church the Coates attended every week, and Reed didn't want her to miss it. "I think she'd choose you over it," he said quickly, "but she does really enjoy it." Denise, Reed, and Jackie were standing around the wide marble island in the kitchen. John had resumed his spot against the wall. Now that he knew Reed wasn't a threat, he could excuse himself outside. But he'd promised to stay through this with Denise, and he would keep his promise, even if she no longer needed him. "Maybe you could come to the potluck," Jackie said. "I bet Ella would love to see you there." "Oh." Denise looked at Reed, a question in her eyes. The man nodded, though the gesture came slowly, as if he'd wrestled with his response. "Cassidy and James usually come, and other people you'll remember. You're welcome, of course." Denise perked up and looked John's way. "We can make it work," he said, "but be warned, we'll stick very close." She gave him a look he read as "You're such a buzzkill," and turned back to Jackie. "In other words, I'll have 3 oversized shadows everywhere I go." John cleared his throat. "4?" She chuckled, shaking her head. I hope that the police are close to figuring out who the Starlit Slayer is, and we might even have an idea who the local shooter is." John had neglected to mention that James had found the name of the kid who'd been obsessed with her. That might lead to something, might not. Denise continued. "So maybe it would be best for me to wait until those threats are managed before Ella and I are together in public." Did Reed's shoulders relax the slightest bit? John had to hand it to the guy. He was trying. "I would prefer that," Reed said, "except for Friday night." Jackie said the words to Reed, then turned to Denise. "You are going to the school play, right?" "Oh, is that this Friday? Ella mentioned it but didn't tell me when. I figured she'd have lots of rehearsals leading up to it." Reed chuckled. "It's not Broadway. I think they rehearsed during music class." "Oh, right." Denise smiled, shaking her head. "It's been a long time since 3rd grade." "It's in the high school auditorium," Jackie said. "Ella is thrilled that you're going to be there." She shifted to face Reed. "We don't want her to be disappointed." "Of course not." To Denise, Reed said, "You should come." That elicited one of Denise's true smiles. "Definitely." She glanced at John, who nodded. They'd make it work. "I'd like to see her before then, though. How about tomorrow? You want to pick her up from school?" They hashed out the details and then headed for the front door. Denise hugged Jackie and squeezed Reed's hand before walking among the bodyguards to the SUV parked in the circular drive. John was about to follow when Reed said, "Can I talk to you?" He watched until Denise was safely in the front seat, then tapped his comm. "Stand guard. Be right there." The guy stood outside the car, facing the quiet forest all around. "I'll be in the lab." Jackie kissed Reed's cheek and walked away. She stepped through a door beneath the staircase, which must have led to the basement. When she was gone, Reed said, "I can't imagine what you think of me." "Sure you can." Reed chuckled. "Okay, yeah. You haven't exactly kept your opinions to yourself." John said nothing, unsure where this conversation was going. "That first day when Denise was shot at, you accused me of being a hypocrite or a liar. I'm neither, not as a rule anyway, but I'm not perfect. I have issues I need to work on. Big issues. As you well know." Truth was, John had imagined Reed's reaction to Denise's news a few different ways. He'd never imagined what he'd seen today. He wasn't sure if he believed it. Had all of that been for Jackie's benefit? The guy obviously cared what his wife thought of him. But he'd kneeled at Denise's feet. He'd shed tears. Actual tears. Which made John think he'd been sincere. Which seemed incredible. John wasn't about to say any of that. "You said you've been studying Christianity?" Reed's question surprised him. "A little. I'm curious." "I just wanted to tell you not to judge Christ by my behavior. He's good and loving and forgiving. He's perfect, and he calls us to be like him. Sometimes we're not very good at it. Most of the time in my case. But that's the thing about God. He loves us anyway." Reed looked at the ceiling for a long moment. When he faced John again, his eyes were watery. The Lord's been telling me to forgive her for 8 years, and for 8 years I've disobeyed him. That's not his fault, it's mine. I don't want to be the reason you reject God. I've been a jerk where Denise is concerned, and an idiot and stubborn and... Anyway, don't look at me. He pointed upward. Look at him. Reed had hovered pretty low on John's deserving respect scale. His behavior for most of the conversation with Denise hadn't urged him higher, until the very end. He'd walked away, then come back a new person, humbling himself in front of a woman he'd despised for a long time. That had moved the man up on the scale. Now he'd humbled himself in front of John. That moved him a little higher. Can I ask you a question? Reed nodded, obviously wary. What did you do earlier when you walked away? My first inclination was to accuse her of making the whole thing up. If Jackie hadn't been here, I'm ashamed to say I might have. Good thing Jackie'd been there, because if Reed had accused Denise of lying, John would have throttled him. Then Reed would have ended up in the hospital, and John would have ended up in handcuffs. Instead, I came back here, he nodded to his office, to pray. The second my knees hit the floor, I knew Denise was telling the truth. How? His shoulders lifted and fell. God knows the truth. He just filled me with certainty, I guess, and conviction for all the ways I've disobeyed him where Denise is concerned. I can't explain it. Huh. John had read enough of the Bible to understand there was a spirit who was like God, or maybe was God. That had something to do with the Trinity, a word he'd heard but not found in the Bible. He was still trying to figure that out. Maybe the spirit had told Reed? It all felt very woo-woo and weird. But the evidence was there. John couldn't imagine what it would be like to hear from God, but he could see the results. Reed had walked away unsure and angry. 5 minutes later, he'd walked back completely different, humble, contrite, forgiving. John had never seen such a transformation. That gives me something to think about, John said. If you ever want to talk about anything or whatever, I doubt you'd want to talk to me, but I have a lot of friends who are better at the Christian walk than I am. I could hook you up. Okay, Reed chuckled. You don't talk much, do you? He did sometimes. He had the night before with Denise, but right now there were too many questions in his head to get much to come out of his mouth. Reed stuck out his hand. I hope we can be friends, or at least civil to each other as long as you're around. John only hesitated a moment before he shook it. Let's agree to civil. Reed smiled. I'll work on the friends thing. John walked out, shaking his head. Denise and Reed and Jackie. This summer, Josie and Thomas. There was something really bizarre about these people. Bizarre and good. His guys moved to the second SUV, and John slipped into the driver's seat of the first. He figured Denise might want to talk, or process, or cry. She certainly didn't need an audience for any of that. What was that about? She asked as he got settled next to her. John wasn't sure how to explain the conversation, and he wasn't sure he should. He just wanted to clear the air. Is it clear then? Her makeup had been wiped away with the tears. Only the mascara remained, framing those dark blue eyes that drew him in. She looked lighter, happier. She radiated joy. Everything in him wanted to take her in his arms and tell her how proud he was of her, how amazing she was, how beautiful. Instead, he shifted into gear. We've agreed to be civil. Wow, such strides. He chuckled and drove out the long driveway. He waited for her to say something, to go over the conversation, to ask him his opinion, but she didn't. She might not want his take on what had happened, but he wanted to share it. I know I have no right to feel this way, but I'm proud of you. What you did back there, facing him and all his anger. It was impressive. Jackie made it easier. She seems really nice. I can't figure out how she ended up with him. Reed is a good man, and I abandoned him with an infant and never told him why. He had reason to hate me. John could almost see what she meant. I'm glad you were there, Denise said. The road by the lake was winding, but he risked a glance. She was staring at him. I did nothing. You gave me courage. You were my support. Oh, well. He'd hoped to be helpful, Apparently, he'd succeeded. He turned at the park and drove through town. It was all fancied up for Christmas. All they needed was snow, and it would be a perfect setting for the holidays. Denise cracked the window, and the notes of "Hark the Herald Angels Sing" filled the car. He felt buoyant enough that he had to restrain himself from singing along. Denise showed no such restraint, despite her terrible voice. Maybe she couldn't carry a tune, but her joy more than made up for it. The music faded, and she raised the window as he turned onto Rattlesnake Road. "Now that Reed doesn't hate me," Denise said, "I can make my home here. I mean, the threats have to be taken care of, but assuming that's managed, assuming Vaughn is caught and stopped, assuming we catch the guy who wants me gone." Her words faded. She sighed. "That's a lot of assumptions." "Have faith." "Faith, huh?" Her voice carried amusement, a bit of a challenge. Maybe he should have chosen a different word. He meant faith in the police, in himself, not faith in God. But maybe faith in God wouldn't hurt. "Anyway," she said, "once the threats are taken care of, I can have a real life here." "That's what you want?" "More than anything." Her words buoyed his spirits even more. If she stayed, and if she wanted to, they could continue to get to know each other, see if there could be something between them besides friendship. Maybe his initial feelings had been right, that they were too different, that their lives were too different. But maybe he'd been wrong. Maybe if she stayed in New Hampshire, they could, what? Fall in love? Get married? Was he ridiculous to even let his mind go there? Probably, but he liked her. More than liked her. He felt more for Denise than he'd felt for any woman, ever, which didn't make any sense. He hadn't known her long enough, but he'd seen her at her worst. He'd seen her scared. He'd seen her angry. He'd seen her confident, brave. He'd seen her as a mother, an ex-wife, a friend. He'd seen enough to know the kind of woman she was. And he liked what he'd seen. Not because she was Denise Masters' movie star, because she was kind, forgiving, courageous, and honest. This line of thinking had his heart rapid firing. "What about the movies? Your job?" "I'll have to travel for filming, of course. A month or two at a time, depending on how big my role is. And then for press junkets. But lots of actors don't live in LA. They don't live in New Hampshire either. It's a long flight. But I could..." A muffled crack came an instant before the SUV lurched. He gripped the wheel and managed to stay on the pavement. But it was slippery. "What the..." Another crack, and the SUV lurched a second time. Those cracks. Gunshots. "Get down!" It was bulletproof glass, but better to be cautious. He wouldn't pull over here. It wouldn't be safe. But the SUV was slipping, sliding. He turned the wheel, but the two remaining tires found no purchase. He hit the brakes, desperate to slow down, to keep the vehicle from careening off the road and crashing into a tree. They slid off the pavement. The tires gripped the dirt, and he managed to bring the vehicle to a stop. Beside him, Denise pressed a hand to her chest. "Thank God we're okay." Voices in his ear. "What happened?" "Somebody's shooting." He tapped his comm. "Quiet. Pull close." He waited for another gunshot, but none came. The shooter was there, somewhere. Moving into better position? If John could, he'd drive another couple hundred yards on the flat tires, get farther away. But the road was slick, despite the lack of rain and snow that day. Had the shooter poured water on it? The air was cold enough to freeze it. Between the two blowouts in the ice, John hadn't had a chance. With only two tires, they wouldn't get far. He closed his eyes to think. Shots came from the left. Agreed? Grant said, "Agreed." Hughes and Marcus echoed him. This was the reason he and Bartlett preferred to hire former special forces. They knew what they were doing. "Arm up. Grant, after Ian moves, you, Hughes, and Marcus slip out the right. Stay out of sight. Get into the woods and backtrack until you can cross. Get behind him." "Copy." Grant was in full-on warrior mode. "Ian, when I say, get out and run to this car. Be seen, and then stay low. Don't get shot." While he talked, he dialed his second team leader. "Copy." But Ian's voice wasn't nearly as confident. He'd been infantry, so he was trained, but not like the rest of them. And he was young, their newest hire. "Hold tight. Hughes, call 911. While Hughes acknowledged the order, Team Two's leader, Jones, answered John's call. What's? We're under attack. 3 miles down Rattlesnake. Careful approach. Road is slick. Come and get Ms. Masters to safety. Copy. The man ended the call. Beside John, Denise said, I'm not leaving you here. He ignored her, climbed into the back seat, then into the cargo area. The hidden compartment was meant to be opened from outside the tailgate, but he managed to get the lid lifted. There were a lot of options in his weapons cache. He chose his favorite, a Browning rifle with a vortex scope. He spoke into his comm. Ready? Grant said, ready. John climbed into the back seat. Denise, I need you to move into the driver's seat. She turned to him. Her face was white. Why? Would she ever follow the rules? Already 2 minutes had passed since the second shot. Do as I say. Now. She hopped over the console. The vehicle is bulletproof. Stay inside. After Ian gets in, keep the doors locked and you'll be safe. Fear was etched on her features. What about you? He smiled. Don't worry about us. This is the fun part. He tapped his comm. Now. In the rear view, he saw Ian hop out of the vehicle. He stood tall enough that, from his spot on the hillside to their left, the shooter would be able to see him. He left his door open, then crouched and bolted to John's SUV. While he moved, Grant, Hughes, and Marcus slipped out and into the woods. Ian climbed in the front passenger seat. You good? John asked. Yup. Team's coming. Stay with her. Get her back to the house and inside. Copy. Wait, she said. I'm not leaving you here. He met her eyes. You know the drill. Do what you're told. We'll be fine. Before she could argue, he slipped out of the car. He dashed up the street about 10 yards, then bolted straight across toward where he guessed the shooter was holed up. Unlike his men, John wanted to be seen. No gunshots. Strange. He moved into the woods and started up a steep incline. Once he was out of earshot of the SUV, he switched his comm so he wouldn't have to tap it to communicate with his guys. 2 things. He kept his voice low. 1, you're all skin and bones. No vests, no helmets. Don't get shot. They echoed, copy. 2, this isn't a kill mission. We're in the US of A. You shoot him without being fired on, you go to jail. Copy. John's 3 teammates were hurtling through the woods to get behind the shooter. He'd approach slowly, from the front, try to keep the guys' focus on him. Considering there'd been no shots after the second one, he guessed the shooter was long gone. This had probably been another scare tactic, but maybe not. Maybe he'd decided to wait for Denise to show herself so he could take her out. John hoped for the second. If the guy was still in the woods, then he and his men would catch him and put an end to this. He crept forward silently, listening. Felt like he was being watched, telling him the guy hadn't run. He kept his gaze and his rifle moving as he scanned the forest, the trees overhead, the brush at his knees. Where are you? Seconds ticked by. A minute. Then Grant said, Found a 4-wheeler. The shooter was close. John could feel it. Rather than risk being overheard, he tapped his earpiece twice to acknowledge. The guys would disable the vehicle, cutting off the shooter's escape. Their chances of catching this guy had just improved drastically. So had their chances of getting shot. He kept moving, kept listening. Then someone bolted through the forest just over the next rise. John ran that direction, but by the time he got there, he couldn't see anything. It was silent again. Any sign? Grant asked. He whispered, moving north parallel to the road. He hated that he couldn't be more specific. 4-wheeler is due west. John tapped the comm again. Something wasn't right. The guy should be headed toward his escape. If he knew John was following, armed, he should be trying to get out of there. If he'd seen the men, then he should have been running from the start, which meant this guy either thought he was too good to get caught, or he didn't care if he was. In other words, he was either stupid or he had nothing to lose. And considering he hadn't been caught yet, he wasn't stupid, which meant John cursed. What? Grant asked. John turned back toward where he'd left Denise. He had a bad feeling the target had made himself heard on purpose, and then backtracked silently. It was what John would have done were the situation reversed. Lead the enemy in the wrong direction. Back, he commanded. Now. Copy. He moved quickly, silently through the woods, taking the shortest distance to where he'd left Denise. There, just at the top of the hill that edged the road, a man crept behind a tree. He wore camouflage pants and jacket, a black hat, black boots. The way he moved, the way he'd planned this. No question this guy was military, if not special forces, which meant that John had to be very careful, because the last thing he wanted was to kill the guy. Behind bulletproof glass, Denise would be safe. Terrified but safe. Moving closer, he got the target in his sights. Today is not a good day to die. He hoped the shooter would freeze. Instead, the man ducked and rolled down the hill toward the road. John bolted that direction and scrambled down the hill after him. Any second, the shooter would lift the rifle and aim at Denise behind the window. She saw him coming and stared, frozen. But the guy shifted the gun to one hand and reached into his pocket. What did he have hidden there? John wasn't about to wait and find out. He tackled him, yanked the rifle from his hands and tossed it aside. His forearm pressed into the back of the guy's neck, pushing his face into the slippery asphalt. He yanked his right hand behind his back. The guy fought, but for all his skills, he wasn't that strong. "I got him. Little help?" To the shooter, he said, "Stop fighting or you'll wake up in the hospital." The man went limp. Just like that, Ian rounded the car. "Get the cuffs," Ian said. "Copy." The rest of his team arrived. Together, they bound the guy with zip-tie restraints. John searched him. He wouldn't think about the grenades he pulled out of the pockets of the guy's jacket. He wouldn't think about what could have happened. John handed them to Grant, then stood and brushed himself off. The car door opened and Denise stepped out. "Get back in the car." He didn't want her anywhere near this guy or the dangerous things he'd brought. She obviously hadn't seen because she ignored John, approaching the man who tried to kill her. John gripped her upper arm. "Please, Denise." The shooter turned her way, and a look of pain flashed in his eyes. "What did I do to you?" she asked. "You killed my son." She backed up a step, another. "I don't... Who is your son?" "Landon." The man's voice hitched on the name. "He loved you. He helped you, and you ignored him. You ignored him." He hurled the words like rocks. The second team arrived from the house, and John could hear sirens coming up Rattlesnake. Denise looked so shocked, so lost. He leaned close. "His name was Landon McLaughlin. He's the kid who changed your tire." She shot John an accusatory look. "James called last night. The cops were supposed to check him out." "Can't check him out," the older man said. No wonder he'd been weak. He looked to be in his 60s. "He's dead, killed himself, because of you." All color leached from Denise's face. John wanted to comfort her, but first he needed to get her off the street and to safety. He slid a hand around her waist and walked her carefully over the black ice to the SUV, waiting just beyond the slippery area. "Go with Jones and the team. I'll be there soon." "It's my fault?" He leaned close, lowered his voice. "No, sweetheart. It's not your fault some random kid killed himself. Just because the guy blames you, that doesn't make it your fault. Go with Jones, and I'll see you when we're done here." One of his guards stepped out of the back seat, and she slid into the center. Looked like they'd brought reinforcements, probably hoping to get in on the action. But the action had been finished before they'd arrived. "See you soon." John tried not to notice the concerned looks on his teammates' faces just before he returned to the shooter and arriving police. Because they'd been shot at? Because of Denise's obvious distress? Or because he was still on comm and he'd called her sweetheart?
Chapter 22. Denise paced her living room, glancing out the front window every time she passed it. The bodyguards had brought her home and escorted her to her door, despite the fact that she'd asked, nicely she might add, to be taken to the police station. "Take it up with Donley." John, who wasn't even there. "Sit tight," one of them said. Sit tight. She needed to talk to John, to find out what was going on. She'd called Detective Pollard, but he hadn't been available to take her call. Some very nice woman had promised he'd get back to her as soon as possible. Which wasn't true, obviously, because it was possible for him to call her now. He just wasn't doing it. She needed to go to town. She needed to talk to that man who'd shot at their car. She needed to know what he was talking about. Landon McLaughlin. The name wasn't even familiar, though John said he was the kid who'd changed her tire. His father blamed her for his death? Why? Because she'd ignored him? She dialed Bruce. "How you holding up? Did I ever get a letter from a kid named Landon McLaughlin?" I don't know. Maybe. Can you check?" He sighed. "It's not like we catalog your fan mail. This kid changed my tire for me a few years ago. He's from here, Coventry." Or so she assumed. What was his name again? Landon McLaughlin. She spelled the last name for him. "Actually, that does sound familiar. I can look. You want to hold, or should I call you back?" "I'll wait." She set the phone on her bar and put it on speaker. After fixing herself a cup of tea, she started working on building a fire, mostly to give her hands something to do. She wouldn't light it, though. Not yet. "Denise!" She snatched the phone. "I'm here. What'd you find?" "Landon McLaughlin's the guy who was sending you those, suggestive letters. The kid who told you how much he loved you and all the ways he wanted to, show you, if you know what I mean." Oh. She remembered. His letters hadn't been over-the-top explicit, though they'd been bad enough. Back when she opened all her own fan mail, she'd gotten used to that. But Landon's letters had creeped her out for another reason. He'd been specific about little things on Denise's body, like the strange freckle on the back of her right hand, the way the skin above her nose wrinkled when she was puzzled or upset, the coconut scent of her shampoo. How had he known those things? Now she understood. He'd known because they'd met in person. They'd spent a little time together. Just a few minutes. But it had been enough for Landon to become fixated on her. His letters were the reason she'd started having Bruce and his people screen her fan mail. "What about him?" Bruce asked. She didn't want to get into it with Bruce. "I'll explain later." She ended the call and resumed pacing. She knew John wanted her to wait for him, but now that Landon's father was in custody, she wouldn't be in danger. She headed for the front door, snatching her keys on the way. She'd drive herself if need be. She yanked it open, earning a surprised look from the guard who stood there. Jones, she remembered. He was probably in his early 30s. Dirty blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, thick brown caterpillar eyebrows that lowered over wide hazel eyes. "I need to get to the police station. Donley will be back soon. You can discuss it with him." "He can meet me there if he wants to." "Just sit tight." He turned back around, dismissing her. "I'll drive myself." She stepped outside, passing him as she descended the steps to her walkway. "Ma'am, you need to—" "You can either drive me, or I'll drive myself." She marched down her driveway. "Those are your options." He kept in step behind her. "Boss, clients on the move. Police station," she said. He paused, then. "I'll tell her." Denise figured she was about to get reprimanded. That day, she'd relived the worst thing that had ever happened to her, twice. She'd withstood Reed's anger and cruelty, which hadn't been easy even if it had ended well. She'd been shot at, left in a car with a virtual stranger, and accused of being the cause of some kid's death. She could handle John's reprimand. Her phone rang just as she reached the detached garage behind the house. She punched in the code to raise the door, then took the phone from her pocket. "Yes?" "What are you doing?" John didn't sound amused. "I want to talk to that man. I need to know—" "You don't need to do anything. You need to sit—" "If you tell me to sit tight, I'm hanging up." That was followed by a beat of silence. His voice lowered, and she guessed he was trying not to be overhead. "Denise, you don't need to be here. You're at the police station?" "Answering questions. Please just stay where you are." "I want to talk to McLaughlin. I need to." "Why?" "Either tell your guys to bring me, or I'm driving myself. Don't think I won't." She heard John's deep inhale, then long exhale. "You promised to do as I told you. Remember? If I say duck, you duck. If I say—" "He's in custody. I'm happy to obey you when my life's in imminent danger. It's not right now." After a long pause, John said, "Fine. Just do as they say. McLaughlin's in custody, but the Starlet Slayer is not. You're not safe." She ended the call and faced Jones. Only when she turned did she realize the rest of the team had joined him. She was surrounded by overlarge bodies wearing concerned faces. "Let's go." When she arrived at the police station, Denise was escorted to a private office, where she waited, alone and not so patiently, for someone to take her to the man who'd shot at her. 4 bodyguards hovered beyond the glass, as if every cop in the building had it out for her. Finally, a 60-something heavyset man stepped in. "Ms. Masters, I'm Chief Coat." He held out a meaty hand, and she stood and shook it. "We've met. You're Reed's uncle, right?" His nod was crisp. "I understand you want to talk to McLaughlin?" "As soon as possible, please." He ran his hand over cropped gray hair. "Can I ask why?" "He holds me responsible for his son's death." Coat nodded. But the thing is, the kid killed himself. There's no reason for you to blame yourself." "I don't blame myself, but there's a reason he blames me. I'd like to know what it is." He tilted his head to one side. "Why?" It was a valid question, and she gave it a little thought before replying. "Because his son is dead. He's obviously hurting. Maybe if he tells me why, it'll help him. Maybe he just needs to be heard." "All due respect, ma'am. I don't see how he's your problem. The guy shot at you 3 times. If I were you, I'd be demanding his prosecution, not a chat." "You're not me." The chief's jaw lowered, then snapped shut. "You got me there. Though I did do a bit of acting back in school. Played Colonel Pickering in Pygmalion." She forced a smile she didn't feel. "I'm sure you missed your calling." "Not even close." He looked past her, out the window and beyond the bodyguards stationed there, toward the cops buzzing about. Police work, this is my calling, and I'm pretty good at it." His gaze found her again. "What do you know about him?" "Nothing. His son changed a tire for me once." "Right. Landon McLaughlin. Kid was disturbed. He had 4 suicide attempts that we know of. 3 of them landed him in a mental hospital, 2 when he was still a juvenile. Meaning, he had issues long before he met you." She thought back to the young man she'd met. He'd been kind and friendly. He'd seemed perfectly fine. But people weren't always what they seemed. And she'd been high, so her judgment had been impaired. "His 4th attempt," Coate said. "Well, you know how that turned out. We learned last night that your bodyguard suspected Landon of the shootings. Course, we also knew Landon couldn't have done it, but Kenneth McLaughlin's had his share of issues. He was in the service, honorably discharged after an injury. Coming home, it's not always easy to slide back into a normal life. His wife left him years ago, taking Landon with her. My understanding is that they had a good relationship, saw each other often." "How do you know so much about them?" "Told you. We got the call last night suggesting Landon might be behind the shootings. We figured the father was the next best guess, so we tried to find him. No luck, but we tracked down his wife. She tells us that after Landon's death, Kenneth retreated from the world, started making threats toward people who rubbed him the wrong way. Not sure about all of it, but I'm guessing mental illness runs in the family. This morning, we discovered that he works for Rossi Properties. Not full-time, but it looks like he's one of the guys who got your house ready for you. We already figured him for our guy when we got the call about the shooting. So he probably has some mental illness." At Denise's remark, Coate nodded. Before he could speak, she continued. "But he's also a hurting father who lost his son. I just want to talk to him, give him the opportunity to say what he needs to say to me. It won't cost me anything." "Not sure what good would come of it. Would any bad come of it?" He stared at her a long moment. "Suppose not." "Okay, then." Coate rubbed his lips together, looking like he wanted to say something else. But then he gestured to the open door. She stepped out, and he led the way. On the far side of the small room, John was seated at a desk speaking to Detective Pollard. He caught sight of her and stood. She could tell by the scowl that he wasn't happy to see her. That wasn't her problem either. None of these men needed to understand why she felt compelled to speak to McLaughlin. She wasn't even sure herself, except that the intensity of it pounded in her chest. Coate stopped in front of a closed door. "I'll come in with you. You're not going to be alone with him. Fair enough. Before Coat opened the door, another voice said, I'm coming too. John. Of course. Coat looked over her head at him. The guy's cuffed. I might be old, but I can handle him. She's my responsibility, John said. Coat looked at her as if waiting for agreement or argument. I don't mind. It'll be crowded. Coat swung the door open. Coat hadn't been exaggerating. The room was tiny, barely large enough for the small table where McLaughlin sat awkwardly, his hands cuffed behind his back. He didn't even turn when they stepped in. But when she rounded the desk, he glared. He started to stand, but Coat said, Keep your seat. He lowered back down while Denise sat across from him. Coat stood in the corner on her side of the room and crossed his arms. John stood behind McLaughlin, who craned his head to see who was there. His eyes widened the slightest bit when he recognized him. Mr. McLaughlin, Denise said. The man turned back to her. His skin was pale, his eyes sunken, his cheeks gaunt, reminding her of pictures she'd seen of people released from POW camps. Starving people, desperate people. She closed her eyes, prayed for words, for wisdom. When she opened them, he stared at her with cold loathing. I'm so sorry to hear about Landon. When did it happen? He blinked, confused. She waited for him to get his bearings. 2 years ago, shot himself with my gun. I'm so sorry, I can't imagine. I have a daughter, a little girl. She was kidnapped a few years ago, and I feared I'd never see her again. The agony of those days. I'm sure it doesn't compare with how you're feeling. You don't care about him. You never cared. He was a nice kid. He changed my tire, then followed me to make sure I made it back to my parents' house safely. I bet he learned all that from you, am I right? How to change a tire? How to protect women? The man licked chapped lips, nodded. He sent me a bunch of letters. McLaughlin jerked forward, and she leaned back, heart racing. And you ignored him! The words were loud. Spittle flew from his lips. John stepped closer, as if to touch him, but Denise shook her head. McLaughlin couldn't hurt her. I sent him a thank you note and a signed photograph for his help. All that did was make it worse. That wasn't my intention. Make what worse? He looked toward the corner, his lips clamping shut and turning down. The mental illness, obviously. Maybe meeting her had exacerbated his problems, but she doubted it. More likely, meeting her had just given him something to fixate on. Maybe none of that mattered at this moment. Mr. McLaughlin? He gave no indication he heard her. I just wanted to say how very sorry I am about your son. I'm sure your heart is broken. She pushed back in her chair. I'll be praying for you and your family. His gaze snapped up. His eyes, already red-rimmed, blazed with fire. Don't bother. You and I don't serve the same God. There's only one, and I do serve him, though admittedly, not always very well. She stood and headed for the door. John had it open, and she was about to step through when the man spoke again. I published your address. She froze, turned back. Coat, who'd approached behind her, rounded the table again and leaned toward the prisoner. You did what now? The man shifted to face Denise. I follow news about you. This morning, there was an article at some online site that claimed you'd been threatened by that Hollywood serial killer. Figured the guy didn't know where you were. Thought I'd help him out. There's more than one way to get you to go away. Her stomach dropped. John scowled. Coat glared. But it didn't matter. Vaughn wasn't going to come to New Hampshire. And anyway, they'd probably already arrested him. McLaughlin smirked, then turned back to face the wall. John gripped her arm and pulled her out of the room. He kept them moving until they were back in the chief's office. The chief followed them in and closed the door. What was that about? She said. Probably nothing. Nothing. John's voice was too loud. He turned away from her to face the chief, quickly giving him a rundown on the Starlit Slayer. You're just telling us this now? He directed the words to John, but Denise answered. All the victims were in L.A. I'm not in danger here. As if she hadn't spoken, John said to the chief, It's why she has so much security. Or, one reason, anyway. You just arrested the second reason. We've been working with CBI Special Agent Frank, if you want to call him. I'll do that. He leaned over his desk and grabbed a pen. Number? John got his phone out and read the numbers aloud. Anything else I need to know? Code asked. I'm not sure you needed to know that. Denise's tone was sharp. She just wanted this to be over. But that wasn't the chief's fault. She took a breath, forced another smile. Sorry, thank you for letting me talk to him. Coate settled in his chair. Whatever the point was. The point was to express my sympathy for his son's death. The point was to tell him I'm praying for him. He gave her a perplexed look, shaking his head. John opened the door, and she started to follow him out. But then she faced the chief again. Any chance you could go easy on him? Behind her, John swore under his breath. Chief Coate looked up, eyebrows hiked. The man shot at you, fired an arrow through your window, and set a trap for you on Rattlesnake today. You're lucky you weren't in a serious accident. He's lucky nobody else hit that icy spot and wrecked. Somebody coming downhill could have been killed. And you want me to go easy on him? He's grieving. He's dangerous. The word came from John. Coate huffed his agreement. Isn't up to me anyway. The prosecutor will decide. Take it up with her. He lifted his phone, dismissing her. John gripped her upper arm. Come on. She walked beside him out of the office, then surrounded by 4 more bodyguards, out a rear door, where one of the SUVs waited. John opened the door to the back seat, and she slid in, another bodyguard at her side. John and a third climbed into the front. There'd be no privacy on the ride back to the house. Based on the scowl on John's face, he wasn't happy with her, not one bit. But they had learned one important thing. Kenneth McLaughlin had broadcast Denise's address to the entire world. Good thing Vaughn would be arrested today. Otherwise, she'd be terrified.
Chapter 23. John didn't speak during the 15-minute ride back to Denise's house. He needed to get his thoughts in line before any words came out of his mouth. In the woods, he'd been focused. Find the enemy and take him out. He'd learned a long time before how to silence everything, but what needed to be done at the moment. He trusted the SUV's bulletproof glass to keep Denise safe until he returned. He'd trusted Ian. He'd trusted his own ability to catch and stop the shooter. When he'd realized the guy was doubling back, he'd stayed focused. When he'd tackled the guy, disarmed him, cuffed him, he'd stayed focused. He'd answered question after question, rehashing what had happened with a uniformed police officer, with Detective Pollard at the scene, then with Pollard again at the station. All that time he'd stayed focused. But now that it was over, he had to face it. What could have happened played like a slideshow across the walls of his mind. If he hadn't realized the shooter's plan, if the shooter had gotten back to the SUV a few moments earlier, Denise could very well be dead now. Ian, too. The SUV might have been able to withstand 1 grenade, maybe 2. But 5? Thank God. Thank God John had gotten to him in time. Stopped him. Saved Denise. Barely. He'd been so sure of his and his team's superiority. He'd been cocky, and he'd almost lost her because of it. He knew where he'd erred. He'd assumed that the shooter wanted to stay safe, to protect himself. John had also assumed that the guy wasn't trying to kill Denise, just to scare her. Both of those things had been true at first. The gunshot at the lake had missed by yards. Someone with McLaughlin's skills, definitely a scare tactic. The arrow through the window wasn't intended to kill, but to warn. Both attacks had allowed the man to escape, which had convinced John that the shooter's freedom was as important as the message he was sending. John had known the shooter was skilled, but hadn't believed him a killer. John had also believed the shooter had a sense of self-protection. Today's events had proved John wrong. McLaughlin had been out for blood, and he'd been willing to die to get it. And Denise, naive, tender-hearted Denise, felt sorry for him. Almost made John want to throttle her. But not quite, because aside from his own arrogance, his own monumental inadequacy, he'd discovered something else that day. Something that made no sense at all. He was in love with her. And all of that needed to be dealt with. He got a text from Lake and knew she was in the guest house waiting for him. He needed to debrief with her, no question. But there was something else he needed to do first. He texted her, telling her he'd need 30 minutes, maybe an hour. She replied, but he didn't read her message. He could guess it. She wasn't happy with him. Join the club. Grant parked, and he, Hughes, and John walked Denise to her door. When the other two walked away, John stood in the opening. "Mind if I come in?" She was halfway across the room when she turned. Her smile had dimmed considerably. "Okay." He closed the door behind him, then checked that all the blinds were closed. No need for an audience. And then he rushed across the room and took her in his arms. "Oh," she said. Just that, nothing else. But she wrapped her arms around his back and settled against his chest and held on. He lowered his head and whispered into her hair, "Thank God you're okay." "I'm thankful you are." While he held her, he allowed himself to relax in the knowledge that she was safe and whole. She hadn't gotten hurt. She hadn't even realized how much danger she'd been in. When his thoughts toward Denise moved in a new direction, unsafe in an entirely different way, he backed up and released her. "Sorry, I needed to." "Me too." She gripped his hand and met his eyes. Their gazes held for a long moment. "There's something else I need to say." Didn't want to end their embrace like this, but it needed to be said. She tilted her head to the side, all innocent curiosity. "You have one job, Denise." "Oh, I told you to get back in the car." "You had it under control." "You didn't know everything. Neither did I. Please." He gripped her shoulders and bent to meet her eyes. "Please trust me. Do as I say. It worked out this time. Next time, you might not be so lucky. So when I say duck, I duck, no questions asked." She swallowed, nodded. "I will. I promise." He released his grip on her arms and stepped back. "Are you hungry? I could fix you something." There were things that needed to be dealt with besides food. "Can we just sit and talk?" "I'd rather—" She walked into the kitchen and gestured to the bar stools on his side of the island. "Have a seat." Not how he'd hoped the conversation would look, but he wasn't about to argue. Rather than sit, he leaned against the edge and watched her. She pulled a package of cooked, shredded chicken out of the freezer and stuck it in the microwave. "What did you want to talk about?" "How are you doing?" She shrugged, then swiveled and stepped into her pantry. She emerged carrying a handful of cans and dropped them on the counter. "Can I help?" She slid them across the bar to him, along with a can opener. "If you'll do the honors." "Sure." He started with black beans. "What are we making?" "Chicken tortilla soup." "Yum." She found an onion. "Maybe by the time it's done, I'll be hungry. If not, you can feed it to your team." "Why make it if you're not hungry?" "I'm too hyped up to sit." "Do you want to talk about it? About the fact that a man shot at us today? That you and your team could have been—" Her voice cracked. She shook her head. "Not really. The team wasn't in danger. Well, not much anyway. Ian had been, but Denise didn't need to know all the gory details. Actually, maybe she did. The police report would be public record. A reporter would learn the facts and publish them soon. It wasn't what John wanted to talk about, but he should tell her everything. We weren't in much danger, but you were, more than I realized." He told her all the ways he'd screwed up because of his arrogance. He told her about the grenades. He told her how close she'd been to harm. She stopped chopping the onion, just watched him until he was finished. "If something had happened to you," he said, "it would have been my fault. I should have left the team with you and gone after the guy myself. I thought I knew what he'd do. I guessed wrong." Her eyes were watery, though from fear or anxiety, or the pungent onion, he didn't know. She wiped them with a paper towel and pushed the cutting board away. "But you stopped him." "Even when I realized he was headed back to the SUV, I thought he'd try to shoot you through the bulletproof glass. I thought you'd be safe until I could get there. But with grenades, I was wrong again." "But you stopped him, John. You stopped him." "I might not have. Don't you see? I could have." He swallowed hard. "I got lucky. You got lucky." "Not lucky. I have a God who protects me. While you were out there, I pulled the 91st Psalm up on my phone and prayed it aloud over all of us. I'm pretty sure Ian thinks I'm insane." John filed the number of the psalm away to read later. He wanted to know what she was talking about. He wanted to know everything that mattered to her. God used you to protect me, she said. He's the one in charge. You did his work today. I almost got you killed today. You might be my bodyguard, John Donnelly, but you're not my protector. I have one of those, and he's a lot bigger and a lot stronger than you are. She swiped the paper towel beneath her eyes again and then resumed the chopping. Just like that. You should fire me for incompetence. She laughed. That's not going to happen. She nodded to the cans in front of him. And those aren't going to open themselves. She finished the onion, plopped a pot on the stove, lit the fire and added some oil. She started chopping a green pepper. When she was finished, she added all the vegetables and sautéed them. He got the lids off the cans and checked the package in the microwave, which had beeped. It was still frozen. Flip that over and set it to defrost for 4 more minutes. Copy. They worked in silence, but John's buzzing phone told him Lake's patience was growing thin. He didn't have much more time. So, I've been reading through the New Testament, he said. She took the package from the microwave, unzipped it, and dumped shredded chicken into the pot on the stove, along with the contents of all the cans. Find anything interesting? He leaned a hip against the countertop beside her. I remembered something I'd read a couple weeks ago, so I looked it up. It's in Galatians. It says something about how there's no slave or free, no male or female, no Greek or Jew. I think it's about how everybody is equal. I think you're right. And I was remembering what you said the other night when we were talking about, he gestured between them, you and me, how you might be famous, but you're a normal person, just like everybody else. She'd been stirring but stopped, watching him a long moment. She adjusted the fire on the gas stove, then leaned against the counter to face him. Okay. If that's true, if we're all equal, then maybe you and I could. He shrugged, embarrassed about his uncertainty. He wasn't the kind of guy to let fear stop him. When this is all over, maybe we could see where this thing goes, this thing between us. Oh, not exactly the response he'd been hoping for. She didn't even flash that natural smile he'd come to love. The thing is, he said, and this is going to sound ridiculous, but the thing is, I'm falling for you. I mean, it's more than that. He took a breath and clarified. I'm falling in love with you. Her eyebrows hiked, her blue eyes widening, but she said nothing. I know we haven't known each other that long. He forced a calm into his words that belied his pounding heart. But what I feel for you is deeper than anything I've ever felt before. Did her lips tip up the slightest bit at the corners? Or was that his hope feeding his imagination? She turned back to the stove and stirred, saying nothing. Or maybe I've got this all wrong. Was that it? Was he just some fanboy? Him and Landon McLaughlin and a million others who'd fallen in love with her? She shook her head. That's not it. So he didn't have it wrong? He was confused. I know it seems too soon to be declaring myself or whatever. Did he just say that like he was the hero from some romance novel? It's just, it happens sometimes. That fast. She looked over her shoulder at him. Does it? My parents knew each other for 9 days before Dad proposed. You're kidding. She turned and leaned against the counter again. Dad loves to tell the story. He'd been with a group of guys at a concert. In front of them, there was this line of beautiful women. They were all up and dancing and singing along. Behind them, Dad and his friends were paying more attention to the women than to the band on the stage. When Dad caught sight of Mom, he asked his friends sitting behind her if they could switch. But the friends said no, that she was hot. He couldn't imagine his mother being described that way and didn't want to think about it. And he was going for it. Dad pulled out his wallet and took out all the cash he had. To hear him tell it, it was a week's worth of food money. John chuckled. He'd decided it would be worth it to go hungry to meet Mom. At this point in the story, Mom always interrupts to say it was $20 of beer money. Denise laughed, which made his heart do a little flip thing. Anyway, he traded places with his friend, and when the concert was over, while all his friends hit on the women in front of them, suggesting bars and drinks and making suggestive, we'll see where it goes comments, Dad asked Mom if she'd go on a date with him the following evening. She was impressed, said yes. They saw each other the next night, a Thursday, and every day after that. 9 days later, Dad asked her to marry him. And she said yes. Just like that. I always thought it was crazy that nobody could fall in love that fast. But then, I met you. Oh, there was that word again. Couldn't she string a few more together? It's just that she turned, adjusted the heat below the soup, and then paced out of the kitchen. She stopped near the table and leaned back on it. He followed until he was right in front of her. She took his hand. It's just that scripture you mentioned, it's talking about people in the church, people in Christ. Oh, apparently her word was contagious. I would love, I have feelings for you, John. Strong feelings, terrifying feelings, but you're not a believer. And there's this command about not being unequally yoked. Before he could ask what she was talking about, she explained, it means you shouldn't be joined to someone who's not at the same place as you, spiritually speaking. It means it would be unhealthy for me to get attached to you because we don't believe the same things. I see. Heat washed over him, shame and embarrassment morphing quickly into anger, and he had to clamp his lips shut to keep that from spilling out. She must have seen something, though, because fear flashed across her face. Fear as if he might hurt her, as if he ever would. The expression faded. It's just, she took a long breath. I've spent a lot of my life living outside of God's will for me, so I know what it costs. God only wants my best. If he tells me I shouldn't be with somebody who doesn't share my faith, as much as I care about that person, as much as I might even love that person, I can't be with him. He dropped her hand and stepped back. So because I'm not a Christian, he hadn't meant to say the word with such disdain, you don't want anything to do with me. I didn't say that. I do want, she sighed. I can't. If you become a believer, you think I should become a Christian so that you and I can date? No, I don't appreciate being manipulated. What? I'm not trying to manipulate you. I'm trying to be honest with you. Yeah, well, he paced into the living area, raked a hand over his hair. Fine. That's fine. He was halfway to the door when he turned. I was thinking I'd have to step down as head of your security, but I guess not. Now that we've figured out the connection with the Starlet Slayer, I won't need to stick as close. John, don't. I'll be around, doing my job until the guy's in custody. He couldn't get out of there fast enough. If you need anything, talk to Grant. Please, let's just... But the rest of her words were lost as he stepped outside and slammed the door. When John stepped into the guest house, his guys looked up from their positions all around the main room. Grant said, Lake's upstairs. John took the steps 2 at a time, desperate to release some of his rage. What he really needed was an hour with his punching bag, and then a long run. Lake stood at the far side of the upstairs bedroom, gazing out into the dark night. He moved past all the air mattresses and stood a few feet from her, crossing his arms. He focused on the messy room instead of outside or at his cousin. Sweetheart? So Lake had heard about his slip at the scene. Don't start with me. She turned to face him, leaning a hip against the wall. At first glance, Lake's eyes looked gray, but when she was scared or angry or frustrated, slight flecks of green flashed. He'd guess frustrated right now. You're going to have to step down as head. I thought so too. She pushed off from the wall. What does that mean? She's not interested. I thought she was. I was wrong. He turned away from her. He didn't want to see the sympathy, the pity surely displayed on her face. She slid her hand around his biceps and squeezed. You want to talk about it? No. He moved out of her reach, mortified, embarrassed. He'd told Denise he loved her, and she'd rejected him. What did she... She doesn't date men outside of her little cult. By cult, do you mean the stupid church? He rounded on his cousin as if it were all her fault. The whole Christianity crap. She won't even consider me unless I become a Christian. Can you believe that? Lake closed her mouth, but he had a very strong feeling there was something in there trying to get out. Just say it. Okay. But she didn't, not for a long time. She leaned back against the wall, swallowed. What? I don't have time. Give me a second to get my thoughts together. He should know better than to press her. Lake was thoughtful, careful with her words. He wondered how much of that she'd learned growing up with an abusive father. John's Uncle Mike had been a bear of a man, quick to anger. John never witnessed the guy hurting Aunt Janie, but he'd seen bruises. Maybe in a household like that, a girl learned to be very, very careful about what came out of her mouth. Finally, Lake said, I think Denise is wise to want to be with somebody who believes the same thing she does. John spun to face her. You think it's wise to reject me just because I don't believe her stupid woo-woo religion? Putting aside the stupid woo-woo part, yes. You have no idea what real marriages are like. What are you talking about? My parents have been married for over 40 years. Again, she took her time answering. My parents didn't have a normal marriage. But the thing is, your parents don't either. They, she shook her head, a small smile appearing for a half second, adore each other, always have as far as I can tell. They're respectful to the point where it's almost funny. They're genuinely grateful when the other does normal household chores. They snuggle together on the couch every night. They laugh at each other's jokes. If they snap at each other, they immediately apologize. Remember we went to that police thing where your dad was honored for heroism? He got on stage and spoke for 5 minutes about how he wouldn't be who he was if not for Aunt Sally, and she's the same way. My parents are happy. What's wrong with that? Nothing, obviously, but your parents are equally matched. They're similar. They have the same ideals, the same values. And then let's take my parents. They came from different backgrounds. Mom grew up in a happy, healthy home. That was true. She grew up with John's father. Their grandparents were pretty amazing people. Meanwhile, Lake said, Dad was abused. Mom was honest and forthright. Dad learned early on how to use his charm to manipulate, to get what he wanted. It's how he got my mother to fall in love with him. She was college educated. He was working class. He believed life is about taking what you need by any means. She believed in love and beauty. John's anger was slipping away as his cousin talked. He squeezed her hand. She was a good mother, a good woman. Lake nodded briskly. The point is, they weren't equally matched. Maybe if they'd had one or two of those differences, it wouldn't have been so awful. But they had nothing in common. Nothing. Your father's a monster. No offense, but I know that, and you're nothing like him. My point is, you and I grew up with extreme examples of what marriage looks like. The best of the best and the worst of the worst. Most marriages fall somewhere in the middle. Marriage is harder than it looked from where you stood. Why go into it knowing there's this huge, monumental thing you don't agree on? Why start out on shaky ground? Is it really that huge? That monumental? I mean, come on. So she believes in God and I don't. So what? Do you really not believe in God, John? Not at all? He didn't. Never had. He knew plenty of guys who prayed when bullets started flying, but he'd never seen anybody whose lives were altered because of those prayers. Well, except for that summer, when Thomas and Josie escaped. And maybe Denise had been protected because she'd prayed that afternoon, or maybe they'd just gotten lucky. And then there was Reed, who'd been transformed into a different person after 5 minutes of prayer. It was possible there was something to what these people believed. I still don't appreciate being manipulated into following her religion just because I want to get to know her better. Lake tilted her head to one side. She'd pulled her blonde hair from the ponytail she always wore when she worked and shook it out. Did she really try to manipulate you? I told her I loved her. She told me she couldn't be with me unless I was a Christian. What do you call that? Lake's eyes grew round. You told her you love her? Stay on point, he snapped. He didn't want to deal with that. You love her? Like for real? She used it against me. Or, hang with me here. Maybe she was honest with you about how she felt, and it ticked you off because it wasn't what you wanted to hear. He was trying to stay angry. If he let the anger slip away, he'd have to deal with what was hiding behind it. All of Lake's logic wasn't helping. Maybe she legitimately doesn't want to fall in love with a man who doesn't believe in something that's vitally important to her. It would be like you marrying a woman who thought weapons were evil and should never be used in any circumstance. That's ridiculous. How could weak people protect themselves from stronger people without weapons? It doesn't even make sense. Lake quirked an eyebrow. He considered what he'd said. It's different. What I believe is logical. Not everybody believes what you believe. Well, those people are stupid, Lake laughed. Don't mince words, cuz. She didn't laugh often, so when she did, it moved him. He'd watched her struggle as a child with her abusive father. Struggle because, though she often escaped to his house, often bringing her little sister with her older sister and mom usually remained trapped at home. Then he'd watched Lake struggle as an adult after what had to have been the most torturous event of her life. Lake's laugh made his heart glow. Not that he'd ever say that out loud. Nobody was intimidated by a man who talked about glowing hearts. Lake continued, "Is it possible that, to Denise, the fact that you don't believe in God is also stupid? Maybe he's that obvious to her." He could see what she meant. A little more of his anger chipped away. Lake's smile slipped. He could tell she had something else on her mind by the way she looked up at the ceiling. So he waited, figuring he wouldn't like it. But he'd always given his cousin space to speak her mind, as she'd always done with him. Finally, she faced him again. "Reed and Jackie go to the same church Denise does." He nodded. He knew that. "You didn't go on Sunday, but I did. The sermon was interesting. I always thought Christianity was like every other religion on the planet. You know, do this, do that, or you're going to get it. Whatever it is." She'd summed up what he thought of religion in a single line. Hindus with karma, what goes around comes around. Buddhists and enlightenment. Jews and Muslims and Christians all believe in some form of heaven for good people, hell for bad people, as if there's some cosmic scale out there. He'd studied just enough of all of them to be unimpressed. If a guy hurts somebody but then gives away all his money to the poor, where does he land? What's the cost of a life? And who gets to decide? And really, is God like some visor-wearing accountant up there, tapping away on an adding machine? It's ridiculous. I agree. Lake's head bobbed to emphasize the point. The thing is, the talk on Sunday made me wonder if I've got it wrong. The pastor said something in passing as if everybody in the room knew it. "Please tell me you didn't drink the Kool-Aid. They serve it in those little cups. Comes with crackers." She gave him a look that clearly told him to shut up. The pastor said that there was no way anybody in the room was good enough to get to heaven. "Great. This just gets better and better. Sign me up." "Do you mind?" He swept his hand in a go-ahead gesture. He said that nobody is good enough because God is holy, which I think maybe means perfect. Anyway, he can't, or maybe won't, allow evil in his presence. That explains why he never shows up down here. She'd been about to say something, but her teeth snapped shut. She considered that a moment. "I'm not sure that's true. I mean, if he's real, and if he's the creator, then maybe everything good is him showing up. Like babies and sunsets and..." What happened to his tough-as-nails cousin? He must have made a face because she punched his shoulder. "Ow!" It didn't really hurt, but he threw her a bone. "I'm just saying there's beauty in the world, and maybe that's from God. And there's also water and food, and we don't all kill each other all the time. Maybe that's God. My mom thought so, you know? Maybe Mom was right. The point is, according to the pastor, God isn't an accountant, weighing good and bad. If he did that, we'd all be lost, which is the whole point of Jesus." I've heard the story, of course. Mom used to tell us about Jesus. He died on the cross and somehow took our sins with him, and then he rose on Easter, right? But the rest of it, she shrugged. "I'm just saying, maybe it's not real, but it's different from the other religions. It's unique." He'd read the accounts in the Bible. It was unbelievable. Literally, in that he couldn't believe it had really happened. But maybe he was wrong. It wouldn't be the first time. He'd been wrong more than he'd been right that day. One more thing to add to the list. "According to the pastor, all you have to do to go to heaven is believe," Lake said. "Imagine that? All your sins wiped out." She swept an arm as if clearing an imaginary board. "Just like that. An eternity in heaven instead of hell, just for believing? It's bizarre." Exactly. But what if it's true? How could it be true? A man died, then came back to life 3 days later. Impossible. But then, they were talking about God here. Maybe he could do what he wanted. John wasn't convinced. Wasn't sure he ever would be. "Do you then? Believe?" I asked Jackie about it. She's pretty amazing. She's like a mad scientist or something. She invented some device that might cure Alzheimer's. The woman's off the charts smart, and she believes this stuff. Lake shrugged. I don't know, but I'm thinking about it. The point is, if Denise believes, it's possible she's not trying to manipulate you. It's possible she'd like you to believe so you can be forgiven and go to heaven. It's possible she told you the truth because she loves you too. Lake had always had good aim, and those words hit right where she'd intended. You were gutsy telling her how you feel, she continued, but don't discount her bravery. Considering how Reed treats her, I think it took guts for her to be honest with you. If he were having this conversation with anybody but his cousin, he'd have walked out long before now. But he loved Lake like a sister. More than that, he respected her. And he had seen some evidence that what these people believed might be true. There was still a problem, though. It's not like I can just conjure up faith. I can't make myself believe something I don't. Wouldn't God, if he's real, know if I was sincere? One assumes, yeah. Jackie told me to ask God to show himself to me. She said he likes to answer that prayer. Maybe you could do the same. He tried to imagine what that would look like. Would he have to get on his knees, like Reed said he'd done that day? It's weird, I know, Lake said. But maybe if you really love Denise, you can get over the weird and just do it. I mean, how can it hurt? Maybe he'd try. Maybe there was still a chance for him and Denise. But he'd have to figure out this whole God and Jesus thing, and then decide if it made any sense at all. He'd spent a lifetime eschewing religion. He didn't see that changing now.
Chapter 24. The chain-link fence was hidden in the trees behind Denise's property and along the sides, but in front, where no trees separated the house from the street, it stuck out like a scar. From the first moment Denise had seen it, she'd loathed it. She had a privacy wall around her home in Beverly Hills, complete with a gated entrance. But it was stone, covered with vines and flowers. It added to the beauty of the place. She'd hoped she could skip all that security in New Hampshire. She understood why it was there, of course. With McLaughlin on the loose, it had been necessary. But that morning, when she'd awakened and looked outside, she'd thought that maybe, soon, they could take it down. The hours since then had proved her wrong. Every single time she looked out the window, a car was driving by slowly or stopped completely, many with phone cameras aimed. A bodyguard stood at the end of her driveway, trying to urge the looky-loos along, but it was a public street. It was also a dead end, so everyone who continued up the mountain eventually had to turn around at the cul-de-sac and come back down. She cursed Kenneth McLaughlin for publishing her address. The allure would wear off. People would forget about her soon enough. And maybe, she didn't even want to consider it, but maybe she'd have to replace that ugly fence with one that would shield her house from the road. Sometimes she hated being famous. Fame, intrusive fans, and the threat of killers didn't bring her mood low as much as remembering the way John had stormed out the night before. She'd hurt him, the last thing she'd wanted to do. But she'd needed to be honest, even if the truth was what neither of them wanted to hear. She'd spent a lot of time that morning praying for John, for his heart, for his salvation, for their relationship, if there could be one, for both of them to be able to move past this if they couldn't. She didn't want that, though. She liked John, really liked him, more than made sense after such a short acquaintance. She and Ella had decorated the tree on Sunday, but hadn't put up any of the other Christmas decorations. After her prayers, Denise made sugar cookie dough and put it in the refrigerator, and then spent the rest of the morning and early afternoon putting out the things she'd purchased to make her home festive. She draped garland from the stair rail and the upstairs hallway that overlooked the living room. She arranged her new nativity scene, which she'd spotted at the store on Sunday, and then ordered online. It looked beautiful on the table near the front door. She pulled out the ceramic snowmen she'd been collecting since she'd purchased the house and put them in various locations around the downstairs. And then came her favorite Christmas decorations in the world, which she'd painstakingly wrapped and shipped here a few weeks earlier. Pictures of Ella sitting on Santa's lap. There were 8 of them. In the first, Santa held a sleeping Ella. In the next, 1-year-old Ella was gazing at the bearded man with awe. The pictures tracked the changes in Denise's daughter, year after year, all the years she'd missed. Denise set them on her mantel, along with a few other red and green decorations, arranging them among more garland. By the time she and her security team picked up Ella from school, the empty boxes had been stashed in the garage. The guards had helped with that, and the house looked beautiful. Ella chattered all the way home, barely leaving Denise time to do much more than nod. But when Denise opened the front door for her, Ella quieted. She crossed the threshold and gazed around before looking up at her mother. "Mommy, it's beautiful!" Denise felt a wide, silly grin. The room had come together nicely, with all the red and green accents. She'd considered doing something more contemporary, maybe blue or even purple, but the traditional colors felt more festive. "I thought we could decorate cookies." Was that something Ella would like? Was it something Jackie and Reed usually did with her? But Ella's eyes sparkled. Yes! They cut out the dough, baked cookies, and decorated them with colored frosting and various sprinkles and candies. Between sugary bites, they talked and laughed and teased. It was, far and away, the best time she'd ever spent with her daughter. Exactly what she'd dreamed of for so long. They were only halfway through the stack of cookies when a knock sounded on the front door. Probably groceries. Denise had put in an order a couple of hours before. But when she pulled it open, John stood on the other side. She hadn't seen him since he'd left the night before. He didn't look much happier now. Dark smudges hovered beneath his eyes. She felt a smile spreading. He might not have wanted to be there, but she was happy to see him. Happier than she would voice. "Come in." Those eyes narrowed. Maybe he'd expected a different reaction. Maybe he'd expected her to be as guarded as he was. She would have been if he'd come before her prayer time. She'd been horrified at how they'd left things the night before. He'd declared his love, and she'd been honest about her feelings. Honest, but her words had hurt him. She hated that. She'd also been more than a little annoyed that he'd rushed out as if she'd laughed in his face. That he'd accused her of trying to manipulate him. She'd left all of that with God. John was lost and hurting. He needed to be loved, not judged. Denise had been judged enough in her life to know the damage it could cause. So she brightened her smile as she stepped back. "I'm happy to see you." He moved inside, closed the door, and stayed there. "Can we talk for a few minutes?" "Ella's here. We're decorating cookies." He looked beyond Denise, and his lips spread into what she thought was meant to be a smile. "Hey, little bit." Denise turned to Ella, who had blue frosting on her cheek and in her hair. "Want to help us?" Ella asked. His gaze flicked back to Denise. "Just need to talk to your mom for a second." "Why don't you keep working?" Denise said. "I'll be right there." Ella scurried to the table, and Denise turned back to John. "It can't wait? I only have her until 7. "I guess it could wait till then." "Okay, we can talk after I drop her off. Are you on duty?" "I was on this morning." "Oh, that was different. You sure you don't want to join us then?" "I'm sure you'd rather I didn't." By the tortured look on his face, he really believed that, proving he was pretty thick. She took his hand and tugged. "Come on, I even have an extra apron." 5 minutes later, he was seated at the kitchen table, wearing a Kiss the Cook apron and a big smile while Ella directed him. "You gotta start with frosting 'cause the candy won't stick straight to the cookies." It seemed that, according to Ella, the cookies and frosting were just a delivery device for the candy. John attended to her as if she were explaining the origins of life, and there would be a test. Ella demonstrated with a pastry bag, giving the ornament-shaped cookie a squiggly line. "Now that's not enough frosting for the bigger candies," she said, "but the little ones'll stick. If you want the big pieces," she plopped a thick blob of frosting on the cookie, "you gotta do something like that." John grabbed a different pastry bag and piped across a Christmas tree cookie. "Like this?" Ella's little eyes lit up. "Yes! And you can use these." She grabbed a bowl of red metallic decorations. "For ornaments." John looked at Denise with a smile. Realizing she'd been staring, she resumed her work on a star-shaped cookie. John and Ella were so engrossed in the decorating process that they didn't even notice when Denise got up to fix dinner. She sautéed the chicken and vegetables in one pan while rice cooked in another. She put a bag full of breaded chicken in the air fryer. She wouldn't eat it, but Ella preferred it to the plain chicken Denise ate. She figured with John there, they'd need it all. She'd bought orange sauce, Ella's favorite, and Thai peanut sauce, hers. She also had Szechuan sauce, which she liked to mix with her peanut sauce to add a little spice. It wasn't exactly authentic Chinese, but she'd made it for Ella in California, and Ella had loved it. More than once, she found herself stopping to watch John and Ella work. The guarded expression John had worn when he'd arrived was long gone, replaced by pure happiness as he decorated, and ate, handfuls of cookies. "Stop eating them," Ella was laughing when she said it. "You're gonna spoil your dinner. Mommy only let me have one." John looked up to find Denise watching and smiled. "Am I in trouble?" "As long as you finish your dinner, young man. You know I will." That she did. She tossed the chicken in the sauces, leaving some of it plain, just in case, and called the two cookie artists to eat at the island. "Ah, but Mommy, I'm almost done." John swooped the complaining child out of her chair and tossed her over his shoulder, then carried her to the chair as she squealed, "Delivery for you, ma'am." "I'm not a delivery, I'm a girl," Denise giggled. "Just set it there, kind sir." He plopped Ella in the seat, and she took in the feast. "Chinese, my favorite." Denise had set a spot for John. "You know you want to." He settled in the chair. After she prayed a blessing over the meal, she explained what each bowl contained, and they dug in. Denise had thought the afternoon with Ella had been perfect already, but John's arrival only improved it. He talked and joked with Ella while Denise ate silently, savoring the moment. How could this man who treated her little girl with such kindness, who was tough and protective when necessary, but also tender-hearted and gentle, who loved her. How could he not be the man for Denise? Oh God, what are you doing? Because God help her, she could see herself loving John back, which meant that if Denise kept her vow to walk with God, both she and John were going to have their hearts ripped to shreds. Reed and Jackie had accepted the container of cookies from Ella with praise for the colorful, candy-caked confections. Denise had worried that Reed's kindness from the afternoon before might have worn off, but he'd thanked her for dropping Ella off, with a smile. And that wasn't even the weirdest thing that happened in the brief exchange at the door. John hadn't joined the team that drove Ella home, so Denise rode in silence back to her house, wondering what he'd wanted to talk to her about. When she got home, John was standing on her front porch. She must have worn a goofy smile because he grinned. "Happy?" "It was a perfect afternoon, thank you." "Me? I didn't do anything but intrude." "I'm glad you did. Feel free to intrude any time." His grin faded, their conversation from the night before suddenly hovering between them. She wasn't sure what to say. Nothing had changed, but their differing spiritual beliefs didn't keep them from enjoying each other's company. "I'm not ready to go inside yet. Can we walk?" "In the back, if that's all right. Unless you want a crowd of men around you." She walked toward the side of the house. The sun had long set, revealing a diamond-studded sky. It couldn't be even 30 degrees, but her coat and gloves were warm enough, and John wore his as well. When the silence became oppressive, she said, "So, the strangest thing just happened at Reed's. I thought maybe you could explain it." "What's that?" "Your cousin, Celia?" He shook his head. "Celeste? Stephanie? You're not even close. What about her?" "She smiled at me." He chuckled. "She does that from time to time, though usually when she thinks nobody's looking. But actually at me, like on purpose. Any idea why?" He shrugged one shoulder, but said nothing. Interesting. Did Denise dare assume that maybe John and Lake had talked about her? Maybe, despite Lake's consummate seriousness, she could approve? It seemed too much to hope for. "She talked me down last night," John finally said. Denise wasn't surprised that John had brought up their conversation from the night before. He wasn't one to avoid difficult subjects. She was surprised that he admitted he'd needed talking down. What kind of man was this who threw everything out in the open? Who didn't feel the need to dance around the truth or pretend he didn't care when he did? A very unusual man, no question. I'm sorry I accused you of trying to manipulate me. It's all right. You said some very, she searched for the best word, honest things to me. You weren't expecting my answer. He dipped his head. Lake helped me see it from your perspective. It didn't change anything, but she was glad he understood. When she reached the backyard, Denise continued to the edge of the forest, gazing between the trees into the darkness. She couldn't make out the fence, but she knew it was there. So I'm looking into it, John said. Whoa! What was that? He stared straight ahead, watching the ground beneath them as if it might shift. What do you mean? If it's that important to you, it seems the least I can do is figure out why you believe what you believe. It feels... He didn't finish that statement. But maybe you're onto something. Maybe it's not just some bizarre woo-woo belief. Woo-woo? His lips twitched. You know, all that spiritual stuff. The idea that there are spirits we can't see and voices nobody can hear. It's weird. So how are you looking into it? You ever heard of C.S. Lewis? She couldn't help the short laugh. Yeah, hadn't you? I didn't know anything about him, except that he wrote those kids' books, and he's quoted a lot. I guess he was an atheist, and then he did some research and decided he believed in Christianity. There are others. She yanked out her phone and started searching. There are lists of them, but two who've written recently are Lee Strobel and Josh McDowell. I've never read Strobel's books, but McDowell has this. It's like an encyclopedia of reasons to believe the Bible and the Gospel. Really? She didn't miss the skepticism in his voice. I bought it for a friend a couple of years ago. Her housekeeper, a proud atheist who'd looked at the thick volume with disdain. When she hadn't taken it home, Denise had perused it, shocked by the pages upon pages of evidence backing up the veracity of the Bible, the history it tells, and the story of Jesus and his apostles. She'd already been a believer, but that book had solidified her faith. I have a copy back in California. It's amazing. I'll look for it. She tapped her Amazon icon, found the book, and bought it. It'll be delivered tomorrow. His look told her he wasn't happy. I can afford to buy my own books. She pretended he'd said nothing. She slipped her hand around his arm and squeezed. The fact that you're willing to consider Christianity, you can't know what that means to me. Maybe you didn't understand what I was saying last night. I think I did. Well, that's what love does, right? It doesn't hold on to its, for lack of a better word, prejudices out of stubbornness or pride. It's sacrificial. Every once in a while, ideas came out of John's mouth that could have come straight from the Bible. For a man who claimed not to believe, he sure seemed to understand a lot. Maybe that was his natural disposition, though knowing what she did about mankind in general, she doubted it. More likely, God had been drawing John close since long before he'd met her. Doesn't mean I'm going to believe. His voice took on a hard edge. And I refuse to pretend, just to make you happy or to make this work. I wouldn't want you to. If you did that, you wouldn't be the man I think you are. He nodded and said nothing. They reached the far corner of the property and turned back toward the house. The trees thinned here. She gazed up at the blanket of stars above. There were so many. She wandered toward the center of the yard, still looking toward the heavens. John took her hand and returned it to his arm. Wouldn't want you to fall. Such a gentleman. But she didn't look his way. She couldn't take her eyes off the show overhead. There are no stars in L.A. She laughed at that. Ironic, right? The only stars there are the pretend ones, the human ones, and the ones cemented into a sidewalk, I guess. But real stars burn bright, not for a season or a couple of decades, but for thousands and thousands of years. Those stars were overhead when Jesus walked the earth, when Moses led the Israelites to the Promised Land, when Noah's Ark rolled over stormy waters. The vastness of it, the beauty. It's overwhelming. When he said nothing, she glanced at him for a reaction and found him watching her. He averted his gaze quickly, then pointed. "The North Star. You see it?" When Denise's mom had pointed out constellations and told her the names of stars, Denise never paid much attention, but she remembered how to find the North Star. "It's the only thing in the heavens that doesn't move," John said. "To me, it's always represented truth, foundational ideas. Like, there are some things that simply don't change. The value of a human life. Good versus evil." He shrugged like he was embarrassed. "I love that. What a great metaphor." The woods were silent, almost reverent, and it felt for a moment like Denise and John were the only two people in the world. Two frail humans and a great big god whispering his love on the breeze. The sound of a squeaky hinge yanked Denise out of the fantasy. One of the guards jogged toward the front of the house. If he'd seen them, he gave no indication. "Anyway," John stepped away and faced her. "That's not why I came over earlier." "Oh, right. You wanted to tell me something. I hate to ruin the moment." She didn't like the sound of that. Those kinds of moments never last anyway. John had been about to speak, but didn't. His eyes narrowed the slightest bit. His head tipped to one side. "You know, silent, reverent moments? Moments when you can feel God. Or, well, I guess maybe you didn't, but—" She shook her head, forcing herself to shut up. John studied her, then gazed into the forest, up to the heavens. "Huh." She didn't know what that meant. Another beat passed before John faced her again. "Agent Frank called. About a month ago, Hubert Vaughn told his kids, they're grown and out of the house, and his assistant that he was going to Europe on an extended vacation. He gave them the name of a hotel where he was planning to stay, claiming the need for a sabbatical." John made air quotes around that word. "The assistant and kids have texted with him a few times. He's told them stories about his vacation, how much fun he's having, all that." Denise's heart sank. If he's in Europe, then he's not, at least not where he'd claimed to be. John went on to explain that Agent Frank had called the hotel, but the clerk had no record of his being there. In the last 2 weeks, the assistant and the kids had all tried calling him, but the calls had gone straight to voicemail. Frank got a warrant to locate his phone, but it's been turned off. Vaughn's off the grid. "Oh!" She should say something more, but John's words were rattling around in her mind. "Looks bad," John said. "Frank and his team think he's their guy." "And you?" "They're the pros. I'm pretty new at this investigating thing, but I tend to agree with them. I mean, why else would he disappear?" "But nobody knows where he is." Her words were barely a whisper. Vaughn could be there now, watching them. John squeezed her hand. "We're not going to let him get within 100 yards of you. Unlike McLaughlin, Vaughn has no military experience, no experience with weapons that we can find. Which tracks with the killings. They're not exactly precision murders, you know." She had no idea what he was talking about and wasn't sure she wanted to. John didn't read her expression. "They're messy. They're much more efficient ways to kill a person, but Vaughn—" He must have seen something in her face because he changed tack. "The point is, if he wants to hurt you, he has to get close. And in order to get close, he's going to have to get through me and my team. He won't. You're safe here." The last thing, the very last thing she wanted, was to come face to face with Vaughn. He'd done unspeakable things to her the last time she'd been in his presence, and this time he'd have a weapon. But she didn't want John or any of his men having to face him either. "Hey!" John took her gloved hands. "I promise. We won't let him get anywhere near you." "Okay." She tried to infuse confidence in her voice, but it didn't work. Because Vaughn had been able to get to all the other women. He'd been patient, bided his time. Denise wouldn't be safe until Vaughn was behind bars. And at that moment, not a soul in the world knew where he was.